Okay, so this video is going to be a quick addendum where we'll talk about how to set up materials in Vray and in Enscape that use like a texture or a bitmap. Starting first of all with Vray, if this is my scene right here and I wanted to set up a couple of materials that have a texture, I'll go ahead and show how to do that right now. First of all, we'll go to Vray up at the top, so we already have that set as our rendering engine. I'm going to click on Asset Editor, and then all the way on the left-hand side where we have our material palette. And so nowadays Vray comes with several built-in materials as default, which are mostly quite good. If you wanted to place one of these in your scene, all you really have to do is find the one you like and drag it in to this panel here on the right. And a lot of what you need for an architectural scene can be found here. Well, let me first of all show you how to do this part. So if we're using our concrete flooring material and we wanted to apply that to objects in our scene, first I'm going to change my view into rendered so I can kind of see what I'm doing a little bit. I'll go to layers, and like I mentioned in past videos, the best way really to set up a render material is to or to apply materials to a scene is to do it by layer, to do it by the materials option in the layer panel. For example, if I wanted the paving here, the ground, to be this concrete flooring, you should be able to, so normally you'd be able to click on the little circle where the material gets assigned to that layer, and from the drop down you should see an option to choose Vray as a material. For some reason it's not working in my install. The other way you can do it is if you select all the objects on that layer. So I'm just going to right click on the layer, select objects, and then I'll right click on my material in the Vray asset editor and go apply to selection. Now, the reason I put it in rendered mode is because, as you can see, now I have a preview of how that texture is being applied in my scene. If I expand my panel to the right, we can see a little quick render preview of what that material looks like. And of course I can adjust any of the settings just the same way I did when I set up my glass. If I wanted the reflections to be a little more dull, I can mess around with that. Okay, but anyway, oh, and actually I should point out, so these are actually both, the reason that doesn't look like it changed very much, these are actually both the reflections you're seeing on this material are defined by a map rather than by these sliders right now. So if I click on the little checkerboard, we can see it's blue. That means there's a map, and that's the map right there. So if I go back, I can do it. If I uncheck, yeah, so you can see there we can start to tune our material a little bit better, so that it's not using the map to determine the reflection; it's using the sliders. You can, of course, and I'll show you how to do this later. You can input your own images as maps, and you can, of course, also mess with, so basically the way this works is anything that's like light, just like with our slider when we set the overall reflectiveness of our material, white is totally reflective, black is totally not reflective. And so it's just using this map and looking at where the colors are lighter and where they're darker, and it's applying the reflectiveness of the material that way. And with a material like concrete, when you apply a map like this, it makes it appear a lot more realistic because it shows us that kind of variation in reflectiveness that you would get with a rougher material like concrete. Anyway, so I'm just going to uncheck that. We don't really need to mess with that for right now. But the other big thing that we want to adjust is going to be the mapping. So like I mentioned around a little bit in here. So we can see that there's a texture, like an image basically, being applied to all of the layers that have this material. And in some cases they're very stretched, and in some cases they're really spread out, and in other cases they look a little bit better. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hide everything else in my scene. First of all, I'm going to get out a perspective view here. I'm going to hide everything else in my scene. So I'm going to type in isolate. So I'm just looking at these objects that I've applied this material to. So you can see that it's stretched. And we want to basically like apply this map in a way, like what it does is by default it'll apply a map to each object, right? So in this case, because this shape is so long, it's like stretching the object. And in this case, because this shape is so large, it's also kind of stretching it beyond where it's meant to go. So in order to make it look consistent, the other thing you'll find is that it looks weird along the edge, kind of like right there. So what we want to do is apply a texture map to these materials, and that will change the way that that image gets like tiled or repeated, or the scale of it, etc. So I'm going to select all of these objects at the same time. I'm going to go to Properties, and at the top I'm going to choose this little cylinder with a checkerboard, red and white checkerboard, and I'm going to click on that. It's called Texture Mapping. And then up here you can see we have all these different options for how a map can be applied. So we can apply planar mapping if it's just a surface. We can apply spherical or cylindrical mapping if it's a, more complex geometry. But because our things are basically boxes of a certain scale, we're going to use box mapping. That's going to allow us to repeat in each dimension x, y, and z by a certain scale. So the first thing, when I click on box mapping, it's going to ask me where do I want it to be based. Basically, that just determines where the mapping will start, where the tiling will start. So I'll click the corner of my floor plate there, and then I'm going to enter, let's start with like 10 feet. And I want to enter 10 by 10 by 10, so I'm just hitting enter for that so it's, a cube, so it's 10 by 10 by 10 in each dimension. Capped, I'm going to leave that set to yes. I'll press enter. And so you can see now that our texture map has been applied. There's a much, the texture of our concrete is much smaller. It's repeating, and it matches across the whole scene, like all the objects match. And if we wanted to adjust it, we just select those objects again. So that texture map we just created is already showing up in our properties panel under texture mapping. You can see here we have under type it says box. You can see this is where we clicked that spot where the mapping started. If we wanted to, we could rotate our mapping. I think I need to rotate the z-axis. So you can kind of see what that does if you look. So if you had a particular rotation that you had in mind, you could do it that way. And down here where it says X, Y, Z size, that's the scale we entered before. So we could change those numbers, and that would be reflected in like how large one kind of tile or one image of that texture is applied. So now we have one material assigned and kind of mapped in the scene. Now I'm going to type in show, bring back all the rest of my objects. Boy, there's a lot of junk in. So then what I'll do is, let's say I wanted to set up a material that I couldn't find a map for in by default in the Vray asset editor. So I also have this layer of this is cement block. So I want to find, and I'm not saying you wouldn't be able to find that. I think you could, but I'm going to go to the internet and just show you how to set this kind of material up for yourself. So I'm going to search for the material I want, and I'll search for texture first of all and see if that brings up anything. And I'm also going to search for repeating, because with a material like like tile or brick or something like that. We also need to make sure that where the edges of our texture map are, the block repeats. Okay. And so I'm also kind of looking for a material that doesn't actually have a lot of detail. This is a good example. This one's fine too, although you can see it has a watermark. But like some of these, for example, this one is a perfect example because of the variation in the texture and the kind of different colors and tones and everything that's going on in this image. I think if we were to render with this texture, we would start to see the tiling. We would see that image get repeated. So I'm going to go for something like this. It's kind of more generic. And like I said, because it's repeatable or repeating, it should kind of should line up at the edges. So I'm going to save this as good spot. Okay, so now we've downloaded a JPEG file. And if I go back to my scene here, and I want to create a new material, so I'll click on the, remember I'm in the Materials Editing tab. I'll go to Create, Asset, and I'll go to Materials, and I'm just going to choose Generic. First of all, I'll rename it. This is my CMU texture, and I'll expand the panel to the right. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we're going to set it up exactly the same way that we set up the glass, except that instead of just using sliders, we're going to use images. So like I explained with concrete, we can actually use an image to define qualities like reflection and refraction and diffuse. So diffuse, if you remember, is just the color of the image. And you can see over here on the right, I have an option to set a texture. And we can see that the checkerboard is grayed out, which means no texture is applied yet. And if I click on that texture, I'm going to get the option, a series of options here. So we can actually do a lot of stuff just with like different tools that Vray has built in. But I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to use my bitmap that I just downloaded. So I'll click on bitmap, and let's see. So I'll go to cement block texture and click open. And there it is. There's my image. So I'll go back. And if I look at my object, you can see that it's now got this like CMU pattern applied to it. So let me go ahead and, like I did before, I'm going to select all objects on that layer. I'm going to select objects. Oops, not that one. Where's my? What layer is that? Oh, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to select all objects on the CMU layer, and I will then apply that. So right-click, apply to selection. So just like with the concrete, you can see the texture mapping is a little stretched. Now, we probably want to be somewhat accurate, especially with a texture like CMU, which has a standardized dimension. We probably want to be somewhat accurate about what size it is, because that's going to really affect our reading of the scale of the image or our reading of the scale of our space when we do our rendering. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, looking at this image I have, where is it? So a CMU block is 8 by 8 by 16. I want to roughly estimate what dimension this overall tile would be, so I can understand what size I should apply when I apply that texture map in Rhino. So if this dimension is all 8, then that's going to be 8 times 4, which is 32 inches. And so we have one block here, and I think this is like basically a split. So we basically have 2 blocks in that dimension, 16 inches plus 16 inches, which is also 32 inches. So we're going to apply a texture map, which is 32 by 32. So again, with those same objects selected, I'm going to go to texture mapping, apply box mapping. I'm going to click on the corner of this wall now, and I'm going to type in 32 with a quote symbol to indicate that I mean inches. And I'll just press enter to use the same dimension for each other direction. And there we go. So this project was actually modeled with the dimension of the CMU in mind, so the windows should actually more or less line up. They're pretty close. But if I wanted to tweak, for example, if I wanted that seam to really line up on the edge of my window, then I'm playing with the XYZ position like that and trying to get it to line up. So where did that jump? 1 to like 3. It's pretty good. Okay. Cool. Then just to explain, so obviously that's a texture that's applied. That's just the CMU. If I wanted the image to appear a little bit more accurate or a little bit more realistic, I could also apply reflections, because even a material like concrete has reflectiveness. So I could just kind of mess around like with these sliders if I wanted to, or I could, like we have with our concrete flooring, I could apply a texture map. And what I actually like to do is use the same exact texture map, but put it under a color correction layer. So there's all these, like these are just kind of generic maps. And these are almost kind of like, some of these are almost kind of like Photoshop adjustments. So if I click on color correction, for example, so we have a color slot here, and you can see we can apply a texture slot to that. So if I click on that guy and go to bitmap and apply that same cement block texture, and then so it's loaded, I'll go back one. We have all these options where we can adjust contrast. We can adjust with a color that doesn't have any, or a texture that doesn't have any color, that obviously doesn't matter. But we can adjust contrast and so on. Then if I go back, now my reflectiveness is being determined by that texture. And I'm just going to drag it down into the reflection glossiness. I'll choose paste as instance. And what that'll do is it'll make it so that both texture slots are going to be kind of the same. And okay. So I'm going to go over here and do a little, I put myself back in perspective view here. I'm going to do like a test render so I can kind of get a sense of what this material is looking like for me. Okay, so I'm going to render. Okay. And then the nice thing about doing, so remember when we set this up originally, when we're in interactive mode, if I'm making adjustments to my material, they can actually be reflected in my scene like live. So you can see actually as this thing begins to develop, we're getting more and more reflectiveness kind of in that surface of that concrete. Now that's looking more polished, which is not really how CMU looks. So I'm going to maybe tweak the reflection glossiness there. And we can just kind of get a sense of how all these adjustments actually affect our material. The other one that I'm going to mess around with really quick is just our bump mapping. So down here we have an option that says bump or normal mapping. I'm going to toggle it to on, and under bump, under texture slot, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm also going to load a color correction. Actually, you know what? Going back, I'm going to clear that. I'm going to load I'm going to try a Bezier. And so just like if we were using curves in Photoshop, we're going to mess around and try and get more contrast out of our image. So in the texture slot of curves, I'm going to load that same image. And oh, I'm going to be in black and white. What I want to do really is get the like seams to look really, really dark, the little mortar joints, and I want the base of the block to be more or less. That's looking pretty good. We might need this contrast. And then I want the face of the block to be completely white. Okay. And so if we're looking over here on the right-hand side, you can see as I'm adjusting those things, the block is beginning to look kind of three-dimensional in a way. Stop dating. Go. And so as I make adjustments to this, we should see, because normally with CMU you have a kind of part of it is kind of popping out and part of it is sticking in. You should see kind of an effect. Start to happen kind of like that. Okay. And of course, the other way to do this, if you don't want to mess around with adjusting a texture, or if you can't get it to look right, just go into Photoshop, Photoshop that image and make it look different, and then bring it back in later. Okay. So I think that pretty much covers the V-Ray side. I'm going to stop this rendering. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do these things in Enscape. So first of all, I'm going to select everything, and I'm just going to go to Material and return it to by layer. I'll just go use layer material there. Okay, so that cleared all the materials we had applied in V-Ray. And then what I can do is, so Enscape works in a little bit different way. If I go to, let me just show you how to do it with the glass, for example. If I click on the glass material, under the drop down, we have so you can actually set up materials in Rhino, and Enscape will do fine. It'll read them. But you can also choose an Enscape material. If I go like that, Enscape, and click OK. And then up at the top in our Enscape menu, we have this button, Tune Materials in the Project. And that's going to open up our material editor. And we have that, I should have called that something else. And so when we made that custom material in the layers panel over there for Enscape, it showed up also in this panel here. And we have a number of default options here. One of them, well, there's a couple of like kind of natural ones that we don't really want to use. And we can kind of see, I think if you open this panel, if you have this panel open, that we're looking kind of at the, or you can even do it in the materials panel up here. So we have a kind of preview over to one side of what that material is looking like. Okay. So I think so in here, obviously we want to have transparency turned on, and you can see that's affecting kind of have to like click out of it to get that update to change, but we want to have transparency turned on. That's the big thing. And when I adjust that slider, it's going to change how kind of see-through our object is. I guess I'm going to turn that all the way up. Under refractive index, I'm going to turn off frosted glass. Under refractive index, I want to set it to 1.5, which is roughly what most like glass is for Windows. And then down here, we can adjust kind of like how the reflections are looking. So specular is really the one we want to change. And we want it to be pretty high for something like glass, I think. Let me go ahead and close this and see if that updates. So that's kind of where we're at. It might actually be a little too reflective, but let's go ahead and start a test render because we should be able to do the same thing, which is like kind of tune the materials in our scene. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on Enscape using that Enscape button. Okay, so there's our scene. So you can see like, you know, that we're getting reflections of the sky, which is good. That's something that we would want to have in our scene. And if I go and look sort of more in the interior of the project, so it's a little bit, I would say, too dark, too reflective, not quite showing us into the space as much as I would like. So I'm going to open that material editor, both up at the same time. Not so much. So I'm going to move my Rhino window out of the way. That material editor. See if we can kind of do this. Okay. So I think, well, yeah, so one thing we can adjust here is going to be the specular. You can see the more we mess with that, the more it'll change like how bright the reflections are. We can also change, I think this kind of just makes them look a little more blurry, the roughness of those reflections there. And then when we, oh, so I had this backwards, I guess. 0, right, that makes sense. No opacity means totally transparent. So if we turn this down more, that's going to be how we make it look a little more transparent. And so I think, yeah, like setting up glass is really kind of just a balance of those things. You know, we want there to be a little bit of opacity. We want there to be reflectiveness, obviously, because that's how glass really looks. And I guess, you know, the greater the opacity, the more the color will matter. You know, so we can change color there. And I think you can also do like a tint color, which will change it. Yeah, that's pretty extreme. Let's tune that down a little bit. Hey. That looks pretty good. See, that looks too colorful. Okay, and then I would probably still tune down the opacity. Okay, cool. So that's how we would set up glass. So we're going to set up most of our materials the same way. So let me close this. Go Rhino back. So for example, if we did our CMU texture, I could click on the layer for that. I'm going to assign Enscape. I'll rename it to CMU so we can find it in our Enscape material editor. Okay, and then I go back to that editor on CMU. So I think with this one, the thing to do, let me, so I can see it, preview there, okay. We can load a texture for this one. So let's click on the little plus sign. We're gonna load our submit block. And there you can see it got applied. Image fade, so we can kind of mix it with a color, I guess. Yeah, so if we wanted it to be like darker or lighter, we could then say this is black, and we're adjusting, adjusting the kind of darkness of it. I think we don't want to do that. But if you wanted, you could do that to adjust what it looks like. And the other thing I'm going to use here, so obviously our specular is going to come down with something like concrete, and the roughness should be high. And I'm also going to use texture. You can see we can actually use the same texture from before. I think by just clicking that use albedo, which is what we set in there. But yeah, we're going to use that same texture. Okay, so I think we can do a test render now. Close this, move Rhino out of the way. And there we go. Actually, like before, because we already set because we already set the texture mapping up in when we did the materials for Vray, it's already applying the block in a way that that I would like. Let's see here. Get to my texture editor. Okay, so and then in here I could change. And so for this, if I wanted to do like different degrees of reflectiveness, I think I would have to actually adjust the image in Photoshop. Let's do that right now. I'll go ahead and open my and then rather than doing hue and saturation, what we want to do is go to exposure. I mean, any of these four in here, brightness, contrast levels, and curves, or exposure is going to allow us to adjust our contrast. So if we wanted to get a little more reflectiveness, or want to brighten that up, it works, I think, the same way. So lighter areas reflect more, darker areas reflect less. Let me just try that all, save as, and we'll call that our reflection texture. And over in Enscape here, so I'll clear, oops. Oh, so I guess you can adjust brightness in here. We don't want to turn it down, we want to turn it up. So, okay. I'm going to click the little trash can to clear it, and then I'll click the plus, and I'll go to our reflectiveness one, and see if that makes any. And it's hard to tell, but I think it probably is making it. Oh, there we go. That makes a big difference. Maybe it is darker, wants to be more reflective. Lighter is less reflective. You can start to see reflections showing up. And obviously, if we turn it way down, we're getting really, really kind of polished looking results. We want a little bit of reflection, right? Like we want it to pick up light around it, but you know, cement blocks and not too much. Okay. And then just to reiterate, with the texture mapping, so obviously we get the preview in our viewport, which is great. And in order to apply a texture mapping so that our material is tiling properly, if I select all the objects on that layer that I just applied the CMU texture to, I'm going to clear the map, which you can do by just clicking this little delete mapping icon. You can see by default, it just applies the texture map to the image, or to the object, like per object. So I'll go to select objects, I'm going to apply box mapping, I'm going to click on the corner where I want the mapping to begin, and then I'm going to use the dimension of the block within my single texture map. So as we discussed, this is 8 inches, so that is a total of 32. This is, I think, like that's 16, but this is one block split in half, so that's also 32. And so then I'm going to type in 32 inches, just keep pressing enter to use that same dimension. And there you see, then it applies that that size of the image when it applies the texture. And as we also discussed before, if I want to tune kind of where the texture map is landing a little bit, which honestly I wouldn't mess too much with that. Like, you don't want to try and land it up to this crazy, but you do end up wanting to do that. It can be so hard to get it really right, especially if you're applying it to the whole scene. But I like better. Okay. Yeah, so you can kind of get it to line up. You plan that out, like your openings lining up with the courses of the block or something like that. Okay, so I think that will pretty much conclude this video, which covers how to do rendering or set up materials with your renderings in Enscape and in Vray. And so the rest of the content for like how to do the renderings themselves will be in the previous videos that cover those two rendering engines. And I will sign off.